Tveite.
Well, I want to start out by telling you yesterday's talk was very conceptual, or at least I thought it was kind of conceptual. Today's talk is, on the other hand, very concrete. Yesterday's talk was, at least for me, an awful lot of work. Today's talk is going to be, for me, an awful lot of fun. So I hope that you have fun today, too, and I would encourage you to participate, get involved in what we're going to do. This is a different kind of participation than Brian did yesterday. We're just going to be talking about this sort of in your mind as we go along kind of participation. I would encourage you not to go ahead in those slides, because I'm going to ask some questions that you can imagine all sorts of answers to, and any learning that might take place will be reduced if you go ahead. Somebody came up to me before the talk and said, "What are you going to do today to start out? You used your only joke yesterday." And I hadn't thought of anything until he said that. And I can point him out to you to anybody who wants to lynch him later, but he made me think of another story I once heard. It was about a young woman who went into her minister, her pastor, for counseling. She had a problem. Now, I guess my worldview is that of a Midwestern Lutheran statistician, so of Norwegian heritage. So this is another part. I mean, if you detect any emotion or any passion about what I'm talking about, I think you must be mistaken, because those of you who know anything about stereotypes, all four of those are very sort of stoic, stereotypical kinds of people. But anyway, this young woman went into her pastor, and I guess I can only envision it being a Lutheran pastor, to talk about her problem. And Lutherans aren't very communicative, especially about things that are very personal and private to themselves, at least as the stereotype goes. And the pastor sat down with her, and he asked what he could do for her. And she said, "Well, Pastor," she said, "I don't know exactly how to say this, but I'm very sexually frustrated." And the pastor said, "Well, it seems like you did a pretty good job saying it. Could you explain a little bit about your frustration to me?" And she said, "Yes." She said, "I've been married 3 times, and I'm still a virgin." And the pastor, and this isn't a dirty joke, honest. And the pastor said, "Well, ma'am, how could that possibly happen?" And she said, "Well, my first marriage, we were very, very young. And after the wedding, we were driving away for our honeymoon. We weren't going to fly anyplace. We were driving away. We got in this terrible auto accident. And my brand new husband was killed. I was hurt very badly. And it took me a long time to recover." And the pastor said, "Oh, that was a terrible tragedy." He said, "I'm very sorry for you." She said, "That's okay. I've gotten over it. It was a long time ago." And the pastor said, "Well, what about your second husband?" "Well, my second husband was an older man, and it wasn't his first marriage. And we got along famously, and at the groom center, he met my best friend for the first time. And he was very taken with her, and she was taken with him. They really got along well, and I was really excited about that, because these people had never met each other. I was very worried about how they would get along." The pastor said, "Well, that sounds great." She said, "The only problem is, after the wedding, they got along so well, they took off together. During the reception, they just disappeared." And the pastor was very empathetic, and he said, "What a tragedy to lose your brand new husband and your best friend at the same time." And she said, "It took me a long time to get over it, and I'm not sure I've completely forgiven them." He said, "Well, what about your third husband?" He said, "Don't I see you in church?" And she said, "Yeah, that's right. We come regularly to church, and I'm still married to him, and we have a good relationship for the most part." And the pastor said, well, what's the deal with him?" And she said, "Well, I got to tell you, this man's a consultant, and he just sits on the edge of the bed and tells me how good it's going to be." People accuse me of all sorts of things, but taking myself too seriously is not usually one of them, since I am both of those things. We're here to talk about some dangers of simple statistical tools. We're here to try to learn something. Now, I'm sure probably none of you will learn anything from this, because what we're going to do is focus on misuses and abuses of simple statistical tools. We're going to talk about some stuff that probably happens in some of your companies, however, although you've never been guilty of any of it. And sort of the genesis of this talk, it comes from a whole bunch of things. My experiences with several companies where I've seen really what I view as very bad misunderstanding of some very fundamental issues and some mistakes that result from that. So that was the beginning of this paper. I sort of started collecting misuses and abuses sort of one at a time. And I have a few of the classic ones here. People have heard this talk before. You know, I didn't develop this talk from scratch in the last week. People who have heard a talk like this before have been excited because of, not because of what they learned, but because of the fact that they can use some of these examples to communicate back in their own company. Dr. Deming talks about not learning from a hack. Hacks are out there who can teach you how to use all sorts of tools. If you're working with a master, whatever that is, I'm not one to categorize anybody as master or hack, but if you're learning from a master, you'll know not only how to use tools, but how not to use tools. Okay? And that's what this talk is about, is how not to use tools. So don't think these are examples of exactly the kind of thing you're going to be doing. The other thing I would ask you to do is, well, first of all, I tell you that I grant pardon to anybody in this room for any past learnings you have. If you are one of the couple people in this room who may have in the past misused one or more of these tools the way I'm talking about, you're granted pardon and forgiveness and all those other things. And the point is, I'm not here to try to humiliate anybody. I'm not here to try to make anybody feel bad about the way they've used tools. So what I'm going to do is ask a series of questions. Basically, I have some examples to present to you, a series of questions to ask you about those examples, and I'll ask you at least to think about answers. Maybe vocalize them. And as Dr. Deming would say, you better be careful because I'm going to lay bear traps. Obvious answers are probably not the right ones. But I want you to honestly think about how you would answer these questions in a one-on-one setting. It's a little more difficult with 300 of you here than it would be one-on-one. Okay. Now, as I go forward, I would ask, first of all, can you hear me in the back? Can you see this? Can you see my overhead? Okay. Well, it's a good thing you said that, because anybody who can't, there are plenty of seats up front. Okay. It works as well for me as it does for Dr. Deming. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today in this very concrete talk, there's some smaller type there. I hope you can still read it. Tools which are often misused and abused. And examples we're going to talk about include things like Pareto diagrams, confidence intervals, histograms, even in parentheses run charts. And we're also going to talk about summary statistics, you know, like X bar and R and S and all that stuff. We have an example to talk about that. Now, when I first told a colleague, it must have been 3 years ago, that I first told a colleague about the incredible number of misuses of Pareto diagrams that I ran into, her response was, oh, come on, you've got to be kidding. You know, she figured us statisticians were trying to make a market for ourselves. She said, you don't need a statistician around to construct a Pareto diagram. It's the simplest tool in all the world. Nobody could possibly misuse a Pareto diagram. That was her statement. So maybe we'll take a look at those first. To set the stage, I have a couple quotes which aren't in your materials, which I've just sort of, and I wish I remember where Dr. Deming got the first quote. I'd rather know a little less than so much that isn't so. All right? Maybe by the time you leave, you'll feel you know a little less. The value in any study can be measured by the number of lines which describe what went wrong. I put quotes around that. That's not a direct quote of Dr. Deming's, but I think I've preserved the intent. And he talks about any tool, any statistical study, any concept has value as long as you understand its limits. So our conversation today is about limits of use of tools. And I see people writing crazily, so I'll wait just a second before we go on. By the way, this was probably a good talk to choose because I can't believe we're going to be here for an hour and a half unless we have some discussion. So maybe we'll get some good discussion. I'm sorry, that's something I'll have to check on as we go forward. To make the overhead as big as possible, we cut off the bottom. That won't be a problem for most of my overheads. Can I go on? As long as you remember the spirit, that's okay. Here's the first example. In a certain process, information about number of errors or defects is gathered, and for the 1st through the 15th of June, 1987, the data are displayed using the Pareto diagram below. A couple notes about this. You might be struck by the high numbers here, 200, 400, 600, 800. This is a production line where they make, 30, 40, 50,000 a day, something like that. They make pretty high volumes. So the numbers need to be taken in that light. And this is a real example with real data. And I've just changed defect types to A through I instead of putting their names. First of all, the names wouldn't mean anything to you. Second of all, they might tell you what industry or what company or, heaven forbid, what plant or application this was. The question is a simple one. What action do you take based on this Pareto diagram? See, my bias is back towards what I said yesterday. Dr. Deming tells us that the basis of any statistical study should be to provide a rational basis for taking action. What action do you take based on this Pareto diagram? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Just yell something out. None? Fix A? It's going to be multiple choice. So need more input? Somebody inevitably asks me, they think that they know I'm going to trick them, especially if they know me, I guess. They say, how expensive are these defect types? That's probably relevant. And I take that out away from them, and I tell them they're equally as expensive. Any one of them causes rejection of the part that's being made. Why would you ask that question? I mean, here's a Pareto diagram. Does it matter if the process is stable? Oh. Well, in this case, from this, can you tell me? No. Okay. Well, I think I can answer that question. Let's look at the Pareto diagram on the next page, which happened to be for the last half of June. Can you tell me the answer to that first question? Is this a stable process? Unlikely. Now see, a lot of people use Pareto diagrams, and again, I wouldn't imply that anybody in this room does it that way, but I probably somewhere in your company there are people who misuse Pareto diagrams. They play, let's pick the winner. So they pick the highest bar, especially if it's a lot higher. People here would say, well, A is not that much taller than B, so maybe we should work on A or B or whatever. They pick the highest bar and choose to work on that one. Okay, and you would say, that's silly, that's a misuse of Pareto diagrams. That's what this is all about. I'm trying to show you how to misuse tools. So here is the next period. A dropped down from 1st to 4th. H went from 8th to 1st. And then the rest of them you see. B is pretty much the same place. It was 2nd, but maybe a little lower in frequency. And D is in there still in C, and G and F and E. What can you tell me now? I'll give you another picture. The 1st through the 16th of July is the next one. Wow. How many of you would like to see a Pareto diagram like that? That tells you what to work on, doesn't it? You know, they talk about New Mountain and Old Mountain Pareto diagrams. I don't know if you've seen that, if you've heard that analogy. A New Mountain Pareto diagram is where one bar or a few bars stand high above all the others. And an Old Mountain Pareto diagram is where they're all like worn down and they all look sort of like foothills. Okay. That's a pretty impressive one. But then what happened to H? Well, it dropped down some again. Well, what can you tell me about this process based on these three Pareto diagrams? Yeah. You'd like to work on A, B, and H. Would you work on them all the same way? Okay. Okay, I would like to understand the causes of the defects in the periods of time and understand that cause to see that it doesn't come back in the future. Did I state fairly? Okay. Usually there's some smart aleck in the audience that says, I know, he says, or, I wouldn't work on I. It's usually from one of the cautious types, you know. Probably a Lutheran. I don't know if you, do people in Ohio know about Lutherans? Well, let's talk about it. I would say, the first question that was asked, is this a stable process, is a relevant question. And we'll come back to your suggestions in just a minute. Is this a stable process is an important question to address. This talk is a theme and variations. That's the theme. We're going to hear all sorts of variations. Based on these data, can you answer the question that was asked? Do you think? Is this process stable? No? Okay. One thing I would...
Could that process actually be stable? Could that just be the random dispersion on a 2-week basis? It all falls
So the question here is, could that process be stable, and could that be random fluctuation over a 3-week period? I would say, looking just at the three Pareto diagrams, I would say that at least with defect type H, it is unlikely that this process is stable with respect to that one defect type. But how can we tell? I mean, we could debate it based on Pareto diagrams, but how can we tell? Let's plot a histogram? Yeah, that'll help. Let's plot a control chart. Here's a control chart for occurrences of defect type B. I chose to look at control charts for defects type B and H because to me they look the most interesting. You could have done, if I was really doing analysis and trying to improve this process, I probably would have looked at more of them. Maybe not I, but the other ones. Okay? So here's a control chart for defect type B. Now what I'll tell you is I goofed. And the reason I goofed is I don't think I really needed to put control limits on that control chart. I mean, comment or question in back? Are we to assume that no changes have been done in this process in all this time period? That's an interesting question, and one that I can almost certainly answer that no intentional conscious changes were made except as reaction to a huge fire. You know, in your place, you probably, in anybody's place, they react to big fires. But what I'll tell you is this was a control chart that was kept on this process this whole time. The data were all in I make a mistake. I said it was a control chart. I think it was a chart with control limits. There's a difference. Some of you understand the difference. To me, a control chart implies there's reaction to the data. Comment. Virtually the same. I mean, it varies plus or minus a few percent. How do I what? Because it was recorded on the chart that I got the data from. In fact, I'll make a confession. Now that I've said I really shouldn't have, why would I say I shouldn't have computed control limits for this process? The process is not stable. I didn't need to compute control limits to see that. Is there a collective gasp from the audience? I mean, usually, I am one of the first people to tell people that you need to compute control limits and have an objective measure in order to determine if a process is stable or not. Why would I say that it seems pretty clear that this process was not stable over this period of time? A wide range? Radical change. How about 14 or 15 points in a row below the center line? I mean, I would say put the average on here, but when you put the average on here and start counting the number of points in a row below the center line, it becomes pretty clear that there's an indication that it wasn't the same cause system creating all of these data points. Okay. I said it yesterday. 2 other people said it too. I don't know if they were teasing me or if that's their statement too, but this is not rocket science, right? Look at that pattern of points. So even defect type B, see, some people want to work on B. Even after looking at all 3 Pareto diagrams, they want to look at B because it's consistently high. And then my question comes around to what I asked the gentleman over here. How do you work on B? Okay. So what I would say is, first I would say what seems to be special in this period of time? Or different in this period of time from this period of time? Pretending that the bad points were the special causes instead of the good points. Okay. Let's take a look at defect type H. I did have the sense not to compute control limits in defect type H. Anybody think they're required? Anybody want to see control limits for defect type H? If you do, I could probably give you the data, okay? But I'm not going to compute them. I mean, I have a hard time believing that this would exhibit stable behavior. Okay? So what would you do here? Probably what ended up happening. If you were plotting this on a control chart, you'd react to this high spike. This high spike is actually made up of 3 days in a row that went up on a sort of a linear basis. So it looks, I didn't put dots in, so it looks like it's just one day. But it was 3 days that went up pretty much in a linear trend. So you'd look for what special was going on there, right? And you'd try to remove it. And that's the way you get better. Now, they probably did that. They probably reacted when it started hurting enough. So again, I would react to H as though a special cause had occurred. But what's the point of all this? The point is simply that a Pareto diagram by itself tells us nothing about what's happening to this process over time. And when we're dealing with processes, as opposed to universes or populations, it's important what's happening over time. How many of you in school had 1 or more statistics courses? I'm not as good as Bill, so I didn't get an exact count. But quite a few. I mean, probably 90% of you. Okay. What percentage of the statistics that you studied in your college statistics class was about processes? 0? Some people are saying 0. If you'd been one of my students, because before I started doing this, I taught college. If you'd been one of my students, I'm not sure you'd have learned anything about processes. Oh, you'd have learned a whole lot about populations and frames and samples from populations, and I could have helped you make all kinds of inferences back to populations. But in the world that most of us live in, especially if we're in industry, there aren't a lot of populations that you're dealing with. Mostly you're dealing with processes, where there are fundamental changes taking place to the cause system every day. I was talking to an academic statistician one time and talking about, it would be really nice if people would learn more about processes and the whole bit about analytic studies like I talked about yesterday in college courses. And he said, oh, we teach all that. And I said, I didn't know where that was. And they said, well, we don't use those words. We use words like model and assumptions and stuff like that. Now, you probably remember hearing those words. And I said, well, what do you do, because he consulted outside of academia, what do you do when you're consulting with a client and you're trying to help them with a problem they have, and you're doing some statistical analyses? Do you use hypothesis tests and confidence intervals in that setting? And he says, oh, yeah, I use that kind of stuff all the time. And I said, well, what do you do to help them predict into the future. He said, you're concerned about violations of the model. He said, what I do is I tell them, if any of these assumptions are violated, all bets are off. Now, these are assumptions that the observations are all coming from the same population, or a random sample from some population. And if that assumption is violated in any way, lack of independence, or that they're not all from the same population, then all bets are off on the statistical inference. I bit my tongue. I wanted to say that seemed like sort of an irresponsible attitude toward clients, but I didn't. Anyway, it's really important, I believe, in most of our settings to understand what's going on fundamentally in the processes which underlie the data which we see. I used to be able to read like exercises in statistical textbooks. I always assigned them to my students. Do problems, 1 through 12. No, I never did that. But selected problems. Now, if I was teaching a college course, you know what I'd do? I'd say, read those same questions and tell me all the questions you should ask to see if this is a relevant question for them to ask you. Does that make sense? But I'm straying. I'm known to do that. First time I gave this talk, somebody said to me, they said, well, you tricked us. You didn't tell us when you showed us this Pareto diagram. You had more evidence, more information. And I said I had to get it. In fact, the Pareto, it's interesting because when these data were shown to me, this Pareto diagram was put in front of me. And I'll tell you, I had to hold back to resist to say, well, what's going on in B? And ask what's going on over time to this process as a whole. Okay? So the question is this process stable? Stable with respect to what? What does it mean for a process to be in control? We say that a lot. I say that a lot. And I would tell you that doesn't really have any meaning by itself. A process can be in control with respect to certain quality characteristics. For example, this process is not in control with respect to defect type, take your pick, defect type B. It is not in control with respect to defect type B. It is not in control with respect to defect type H. It might be in control with respect to defect type, well, just about any of the other ones, C, A, G, F, E, D. It could be in control with respect to any of those. I didn't examine that. Okay? So saying a process is in control without any other qualifiers, I don't think has very much meaning. And every other one that you aren't monitoring. And I would say that that's an incredible statement to make. I would challenge you, because I don't know of very many processes that would be in control with respect to any quality characteristic you might choose. An example I like to use, I don't know if any of you have been to Dr. Deming's seminar. He talks about golfers. He talks about golfers taking training, and he talks about golfers being an unhappy lot. You've heard that, right? And he also tells people that he understands exactly how they feel. He played the game once in 1929, lost the ball and quit. But anyway, I used to be a golfer. Now I golf, 3 or 4 or 5 times a year. If you plotted my scores on a control chart, my golf game would be in control with respect to my scores. With a high mean and incredibly high variation, but with respect to those scores, it would be in control. If you chose to chart something else, like if you could chart the consistency with which I hit the ball, where in the face of the club, well, if I hit it on the face of the club, where I hit the ball, and measured that somehow, I think you would probably find that it's not in control. Again, you might find it's in control with very wide variation. All I know is the results aren't what I would wish. Anyway, the first time I did this, somebody said, we would have been much better off if you'd have taken those 3 Pareto diagrams and combined them into one. That would have given us the true picture. Is that a good idea? I'd say that's worse. You're better off looking at 3 individual Pareto diagrams over time than looking at one aggregated over a big period of time. See, a Pareto diagram is designed to tell you what was the most prevalent kind of defect, not what will be. So you need to combine Pareto diagrams with the concept of statistical control. The point made to death, right? So we can move on. Well, if that was Pareto diagram example 1, guess what? There's a Pareto diagram example 2 coming up. And this one says, given the Pareto diagram below, where should you work for improvement? Knowing now that I've guaranteed that nobody in my audience will ever make the mistake again of assuming a Pareto diagram implies that the data come from a stable system, I tell you in parentheses, I give you a note. The process which generated these data is stable. And I'll tell you, I should take back what I said. This process is probably stable with respect to just about any quality characteristic you want to measure, or at least almost any relevant one. It is probably more stable than just about any process you will see in your careers. Now, given that as a caveat, I mean, statisticians don't make statements that are that absolute very often, so you better take advantage of it because there probably won't be another one. What action do you take? What is it telling you about the process? Do you work on defect type B this time? There's no particular evidence that B is worse than A. Okay. Because, you know, A, oh, wait, the B is worse than A. Most people in your companies would react that way, right? They would say, there's no information here. See, what I can often get is people, if there's not somebody who, if nobody wants to work on B because they say, well, there's some others that are kind of close, usually at least they'll say, well, we don't work on A. Let me tell you the process that delivered these data. I took a die and I rolled it 60 times. And B is the number of 2s that occurred in 60 rolls of a single die. And A is the number of 1s that occurred. And you're exactly right. In this case, there's no statistical evidence that B is any different than A. Do people keep that in mind when they interpret Pareto diagrams? You will, right? See, one of the tricks here is that this isn't an especially large number of defects. I mean, if I'd rolled the die 600 times, the relative heights would be much closer. The absolute difference would actually be greater, probably, but the relative heights would be closer. Instead of, you know, if I rolled it 60 times, if rolling a die was a random occurrence of each of the 6 faces, which I'm not willing to accept necessarily that it is, but if you accepted that, you'd sort of expect each face to come up 10 times. And you could figure out the variation of that number. And both of these would be contained inside those limits. If I'd rolled it 100, I mean, if I'd rolled it 600 times, you'd have expected an average of 100. And you'd have expected on the order of a half the variation, the relative variation occurs here. Does that make sense? In other words, if the standard deviation here was, I should figure it out sometime, but if it were whatever it was, if you'd rolled it 10 times as many times, you'd expect the standard deviation, to be 3 times, square root of 10 times as large. Okay? But you'd expect the average to be 10 times as high. Somebody's shaking their head. Are you responding to me? No, okay. This is an illustration of a very fundamental law of statistics that's not in your notes, and you might all want to write it down. But you probably should listen to it first. Okay, so you got your pens ready. Of any group of 6 numbers, 1 will be the largest. Corollary, of any group of 6 numbers, 1 will be the smallest. Oh, sure, there can be ties. Let's not get picky. Okay. But being the largest or being the smallest does not necessarily give us evidence that it does anything to predict the future. As Dr. Deming says in all his seminars many times, and he attributes it to me. I'm not sure I ever said it. I've never said that to an audience before. But he tells people over and over that Michael Tveite told him several years ago that management is not playing games. Picking the high one would be playing games. In this case, the high one won or lost the game. It doesn't predict the future. So if you take action on the future based on that, you might be in trouble. Okay. I told him something like that, but he's added a lot of meaning to it. Any comment about that? One of the frustrations that some of my students have is after they've gone through one of my classes and if this is the first time they're seeing how to compute one of these things, most of them have run into them before, but if they're seeing how to compute them and then I give them all these caveats, they say, when will I ever use these things? Are you telling me I should never use these tools? I think there are examples where the tools can be useful. I think, though, to use the tools, you better know the limits. Is that a reasonable statement? Well, let's see. I've addressed you at the logical level. So it's the physical and emotional parts that we need to work on. All right, here's an example that says it's a confidence interval example. Start out with just a little bit of information. Consider a political poll conducted 2 weeks before an election. Hey, 2 weeks, that's not very far.
Can I go back to the information? Just thinking of, you said that we check that this process, let's say I got this data, and the process is stable.
Mm-hmm.
We have that information.
Okay, now we're talking about example 2. The process is stable, right? The process is stable.
Second thing we see very clearly is this is high.
B was highest. I won't argue.
You know, I agree with the point you made that since we know the example that you went through, that obviously that doesn't mean that we should work on it. But in a practical case, what exactly would be a recommendation? Could you close with that? Essentially, if I hear you right, you're saying you should look at more data, I guess, in a time sequence.
Okay, so the question there is, if what I've just done is sort of undermine the way a lot of people use Pareto diagrams. Because B was the highest, and what I'm saying is there's no predictability that B will be the highest in the future. What can we do? How can we use a Pareto diagram to see if something seems like it should be the highest in the future? Anybody got any idea? All right, put them in a time series.
Yeah, let's say that the edge of the die is where, one of the eyes popped out, or something happened.
Something happened. Okay.
Special class / common cause. You can't identify that by looking at them in this manner. You
Okay.
have to look at it in a more dynamic framework.
All right, you can't identify special causes by looking at things in the Pareto diagram. You have to look at it in a more dynamic framework, if that's what you said. So you need to look at it over time. But I'm not sure that, if you plotted these consistently, one versus another over time, you would see that they flip-flopped. In fact, I've seen places where people have, on a single chart, plotted, for example, the number of one defect versus, and then on the same chart plotted the occurrences of another defect type, and then so on, to see if, at least visually, is there any evidence that one of these has set itself apart from the others. For example, if we plotted them and then we saw one of them up here, we might be able to, consistently up there, we might be able to say, there's some evidence that that one seems to be different or occurring higher predictably than the others. I mean, that's a simple graphical device you could use, that you could plot them all on the same scale and see what kind of relative magnitude they had over a period of time. That's something you could do. You have your hand up. You want to yell? You need to talk. Please stand up when you talk. I think it helps people hear.
If I go back to your dying example, what that tells me is I can still take a decision as to what I wish to work on, but I don't necessarily have to, it's not based on that.
Thank you. In fact, so you can make a decision from that on the die example about what to work on, but it's not necessarily based on the Pareto diagram. Another of the messages I have for you today is do not do statistics in a mindless way. Now, that's a long way for me to come, let me tell you. Because it used to be the only way I knew how to do statistics. And that's not supposed to be funny, but it's true. So statistics as a discipline, academic or otherwise, is a service discipline. It has its most power when combined with subject, combined with knowledge of process, understanding of the subject. Okay, so that's an important point. So this is one thing you could do to determine if there's really sort of a repeatable, replicatable difference. If you had one Pareto diagram, is there anything you could do? Yes?
You might be able to add something to that, maybe dollars in respect to
Okay.
A, B, C, D, or E, or F.
Clearly, in order to figure out where to work, you might want to weight those things by some kind of other scale. Whether, I mean, you could do it by dollars, maybe. You could do it by people hours. I mean, if there's a relevant scale, you could use it. You could scale those defects and try to weight them that way. But you also might. I don't know how many of you own Bill Schirkenbach's book, but in his book he talks about, guess what? There's variation in things. And maybe what we want to do is ask the question that we ask with control charts. Maybe we want to ask, is it reasonable to assume that those numbers of defects all came from the same system? So based on these 6 values here, whoops, that doesn't help you. I got carried away. No, it was a mistake. Statisticians don't get carried away, right? Based on these 6 values, is it reasonable to assume, based on their average and stuff like that, that this is a pattern you could see by chance? I mean, fundamentally, that's the question a control chart tries to address. So you could ask the kind of question you'd ask on a control chart. You could figure out an average and figure out what control limits would be if this were a process of 6 independently occurring things. And say, do they all fit in the same system? Is it reasonable to assume that they all were created by the same system? So that's another thing you could do. Compute a control chart just of those 6 numbers and see if any of them fell outside the limits. Okay? See, that's one of Dr. Deming's, I really don't want to get stuck in performance appraisal much, but that's one of Dr. Deming's concerns about performance appraisal. Maybe some of the values that are assigned to people come as though they were rolling dice, and there's a lot of variation, or drawing beads out of a box. And let's understand that variation before we go too far. Okay? Did that address the question you had? Okay. Ready to go on? All right, now here's a political opinion poll. Consider a political poll conducted 2 weeks before an election. Suppose the results of that poll is that 55% of the people polled stated that if the election were held today, because that's the way they always ask these questions, just, they would vote for candidate A. Who would you pick to win the election? And I can hear everybody out there saying, what do you think we are, a bunch of dummies? Where's an estimate of variation? There's no estimate of variation here. I might have talked to 20 people, and 11 of them said they'd favor candidate A. Is that evidence for you to say to pick a winner? No. Nobody would do that. Sorry? How many candidates are there? Let's assume, for simplicity's sake, at this point, there are only 2. You might also ask, how do we gather this sample? Do we just call people with telephones? Talk about classic blunders. Do we just talk to our friends? Let's assume that this sample was gathered in the best possible way. It's the most representative sample ever construed. And I'm not sure the interpretation would change that much. Would it help if I told you? Because this is the kind of stuff I used to teach my students. Would it help if I told you that the pollster has now stated that she's 95% confident that the interval 53 to 57% contains the true proportion favoring candidate A? Would that help? Blank faces. Oh, come on. It's after lunch, I know. But there got to be people interspersed throughout this audience that had some of those onions at lunch. So I'm sure there won't be anybody falling asleep, right? Does that help? Yes? Would you pick a winner now? You would pick one? Okay, we'll find out. Yeah.
I wouldn't pick either one at that period of time because at that time when it was taken, that's valid, but for next week or the week after, it may not be valid.
Okay, at the time it's taken, it's valid, but for next week or the week after, it might not be valid. Well, all right. Well, how about if I make it a bigger sample? Would that help you out? I'll take a bigger sample. So now I'm not 95% confident, so I'm 99.9% confident. Statisticians don't get more confident than that. That the interval 54 to 56% contains the true proportion favoring A. Does that help? According to your argument, it doesn't, does it? It gives me more belief that it's really reflecting what's going to happen today, right? Yes? Okay. Oh, okay. So I see. Well, we've isolated it here. We've got a betting man in the audience. Okay. He's probably one of those guys who, when he goes to a baseball game, you bet on whether the next pitch is going to be a ball or a strike, too. Anyway, or if the next pitch is going to happen. Anybody try to go to the ball game last night? Yeah? You went to the ball game?
The point I wanted to make is if I were asked to evaluate that, I'd get a new statistician. Because for one thing, I think you should be looking at the prediction limits, which is a wider interval of a future event, and not a prediction limit.
Ah, you should be looking at the prediction limits instead of the confidence limits. You know what? Confidence limits have some meaning. I do not believe prediction limits in the world in which we live have any. I know, that's my opinion. Because what I would tell you is what we need to know is what's going on in the underlying process. So let's look at a couple scenarios and see if you all have the same opinion. See, it seems to me prediction limits, would they be formed in this point? I mean, you know, I could take a sample today and get prediction limits for the future, right? All right, tell me if the prediction limits would be equally as valid with these three scenarios. Scenario 1, do you feel good about betting on A? Do you believe this can happen? Well, wait a minute, we just got a confidence interval that's like really teeny. They measure different things, folks. Confidence intervals measure sampling variation of sampling from a population. What we're looking at here is a process. We're looking at the process of the public making up their mind who they want to vote for. Is it conceivable that results of that process could fluctuate that wildly? Even if we make a simplifying assumption that just A and B are in this race? Is that possible? Sure, it's possible. Anybody want to pick a winner here? You still feel like we got a better chance with A than B? Okay, let's look at scenario 2. Scenario 2 is my favorite. Scenario 2 is my favorite. I like to call this the Donna Rice scenario. Or if that strikes a little close to home, you might call it the Dan Quayle scenario. Here we are this week. Now you still feel good about A? Oh. Let's go back to the prediction interval issue. Those prediction intervals equally, I mean, you get the same prediction interval, right, from that point estimate. Do they have meaning, equal meaning in both cases? Now, usually with a prediction interval, you would attach a confidence like 95%. I wonder where that 95% comes from. all kinds of assumptions about the fact that the underlying process is stable, generating it's the same cause system generating the same population time after time. Anybody want to pick the winner here? Now, if you're all saying no, we must not have many managers in the audience. Because managers are taught to know that this happens all the time, right? We got a trend, 3 points in a row. Okay? All right, so I was excessive, 2 points in a row. Maybe the damage has been done. Maybe it'll stabilize here for the next couple weeks, and if we were for candidate A, we'll escape. Maybe we can do something to stem the tide. Maybe there's a skeleton in candidate B's closet. There are lots of maybes here, right? The data don't give us the answer. The data, combined with our knowledge of the process, can help us make a more informed decision. Do I believe I can put a confidence limit on that? A percentage? I will say no such thing. And that's just my personal opinion. I will not add that kind of precision, which I don't believe can possibly be there, to that statement. I might say, together with my knowledge of me as a statistician working together with the other people in this political campaign are going to make a projection of what's going to happen. But it's based on the statistics plus the knowledge of the process. Okay? I mean, it's a simple point, but I think it's important. All right, scenario 3. Now, who's going to win the election? I hope I've made you skeptical. Not cynical, I hope, but skeptical. I would like to know what has been happening in the process to make that trend appear. And is it likely to continue? Who knows? Maybe our Donna Rice is lying 1 week in front of us. That may be not a very good choice of verbs there. Or laying or whatever. Anyway, whatever verb I chose was probably not a very good choice for whatever reasons. But even here, if I didn't know about the process by which this campaign were being conducted and what was likely to happen in the intervening period, I'd be very reluctant to make a prediction. Very reluctant. Okay? Yes? That's right. That's right. So you could do nothing. Now, did everybody hear those statements? He outlined my assumptions very clearly, I think. You said, you started out with a statement, if the election were held today. And then you said, I have a snapshot in time, and based on one snapshot in time, you can't predict the future based on that, right? Uh-huh. That's the way I said the question was asked in the campaign. So are you telling me I misled you? Oh, all right. But during any political poll, pick up the newspaper. During any political campaign, pick up the newspaper. What is the question they ask to try to figure out who's leading? If the election were held today, who would you vote for? Yeah, but if you're candidate A or work for candidate A, you really don't. You really couldn't care less what really would happen today. You really want to know is what's going to happen when the election occurs. So what you're saying is I should ask the question, if the election were held 2 weeks from now, who would you vote for? So what you should ask instead of if the election were held today is you should ask, who will you vote for 2 weeks from now? But see, I didn't write the question. I got it from a newspaper. That's what newspapers ask. And so what you're telling me is if I ask that question and then try to take that question and interpret it and make a prediction, that's not a very good idea. But I would tell you that our newspapers do that all the time. So next time you see that in your newspaper, write a letter to the editor and say, that's not a good idea. I'm sorry, what? I missed that. That's the point, right, right. Yeah, and I think that happens, but it happens a lot. All I'm trying to do is make you think, maybe you would have asked the right questions to begin with, probably. But if you wouldn't have, I'm trying to get you to think in terms of asking some different questions. Pick up the newspaper any day in your town, community, city, whatever, and you will be able to see lots and lots of incredible leaps that people make based on data that often, mostly, is a single snapshot, and they make incredible statements about those things. And if we could make, well, the news media aware, it probably wouldn't do any good because they don't think they could sell papers if they didn't make those incredible statements. But, you know, the Minneapolis Tribune, I happen to be from Minneapolis. Minneapolis Tribune, actually, when they do political polls, they do all the analysis of the data, and then they inevitably plot run charts. You might say that's laudable. I think it's reactive behavior. They did this poll, and like it was predictable for a while that they would make the wrong conclusion. They had like 4 or 5 gaffes in a row, big gaffes. I mean, this weekly poll, and they would like be way off. And so that they're now have sought some guidance, and now I think they're much more responsible in the way they do it. Okay. So at least having this information will allow you to ask the questions and have some basis of getting an idea, satisfaction. Comment or question? Okay, maybe if you knew how many were strong in each camp versus the number uncommitted, that would be something that would be useful too. Certainly, but again, I would say let's know the process. Let's understand what's going to happen between now and the election. You don't have to really go very far back to figure out somebody who goofed when they were doing a big major projection of a political campaign. What happened to Daniel Ortega? Nobody remembers him, huh? You know, down in Nicaragua. What happened to him? Did this happen to him? I don't think so. You know what I think happened to him? I think he had a different kind of problem. For some reason, people didn't seem to answer the question honestly. If they didn't favor him, somehow they just didn't tell the pollsters that that was their real opinion. I wonder why not. Any comment or question? In summary of this piece, the confidence intervals, I'll tell you there are at least 2, oh my gosh, this has been around for a long time. There are at least 2 sources of variation which impact our ability to predict the future. Random fluctuation, common cause kind of variation. Confidence intervals, predictions, hypothesis tests, and other classical statistic measures can measure this. They can address this. They can help us understand this, at least to some extent. This is the only kind of variation which is important in enumerative studies. Remember, I defined those yesterday, so I didn't bring the slides with me today. Enumerative studies are the ones that count, ask what, enumerate, number, you know. Second source of variation is variation due to change or changes in the underlying cause system. This is an important, in fact, a critical kind of variation to know about in analytic studies. When Dr. Deming has taken to saying every theory is true in its own world. And the question is, if we want to use the theories, does the world they are true in have any connection with the world in which we live? So, for example, when I was teaching my students, you know, I got a confession to make. When I got out of school, I went to Iowa State University and studied and got a PhD in statistics. And I got out of graduate school and went to teach at a small private liberal arts college in Minnesota. And after 3 years of that, I met Dr. Deming. And I realized after I met Dr. Deming that I wasn't a statistician at all. I was a mathematician. I didn't know anything about variation, really. I mean, I knew about random fluctuation and dice and cards and all those good things, but I didn't know about variation. I didn't have a feel for variation. I was a mathematics student as an undergraduate, and I was a mathematics student really as a graduate student. Now, I'm not trying to impugn my alma mater. Iowa State University is one of the best schools in the country for statistics, especially for, get this, applied statistics. But I came out, and I was a mathematician, not a statistician. So a lot of this is very deeply felt by me, because this is stuff that I was teaching people wrong for several years. Or I believe it's wrong. Or at least it has very little connection with the world in which most of us live today. All right, that's all preface to saying that every statistical theorem I ever taught my students was correct, except for the mistakes I made. But that a lot of them just don't have very much connection to the world in which my students probably live now. When I was a graduate student, I taught business statistics, I taught engineering statistics, I taught agricultural statistics. And I couldn't figure out why the students thought this was an uninteresting, irrelevant class. Because I loved math. But if I were going to go back now, I would try to teach them the same things I taught them, but I would try to teach them other things which would help them get a better connection to the world they live in. Okay? So I guess that's just true confessions. And so that's where I'm coming from. So I believe the second part is something that at least I really didn't teach my students. And when I have access to academia at this point, I try to emphasize the importance of this. Comment? Yes? Okay. The fundamental difference is, let me see if I can draw you a picture. Now, being a statistician, I shouldn't be so self-deprecating about that. I'm just playing on the stereotypes I know most of you hold. What I want to understand is, in the first case, here's a distribution, and we can study all about the variation in this distribution and understand and predict the mean of this distribution and the standard deviation and all sorts of other things. Okay, that's the first piece of it. The second piece of it says, and that makes the assumption that this is a distribution and it will be the distribution and it has been the distribution. The second piece of it says, which is it? Do we have the same distribution here and here and here? Whoops, it's moving. It's not supposed to have a trend in it, folks. I couldn't do art, so I went into statistics. Does it have the same average, the same standard deviation over time? Is this what I'm looking at? If this is time flowing this way, is it the same distribution time after time after time after time? Or is it something like maybe this distribution today, this distribution tomorrow, this distribution the next day, and the day after that, there's part of it there and part of it there. The day after that is back here, and then it's here. And in this case, if I ask you what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day, you might want to try to tell me, right? In this case, if I ask you what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day, what are you laughing about? Okay? That's the difference from my perspective. This is the difference between a common cause system, which is replicating itself, acting a lot like a population, day after day after day after day, and a system dominated by special causes where the cause system is changing one day to the next. So here we've got the problem of understanding the random fluctuation in the system. Here we've got to understand the systematic plus any random fluctuation. And in predicting the future, the systematic variation here is a bigger impact than the random variation. Anybody have any question about that? So if you're in this world and your boss asks you to make a prediction of what's going to happen next week, what do? What? Yes? These people are honest. I have a lot of people who shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know. And I say, yeah, right. That's what you do when your boss comes into your office and says, what's going to happen next week? You say, I don't know. And your boss says, I don't know why you're here, so. So you guess. And if you need to, you might manipulate. No, you would never manipulate the numbers. No. Okay. But you make a guess about what's going to happen. So the difference is, are we talking about fundamental changes in the underlying cause system? Or are we talking about the fluctuation day to day being because of sort of random fluctuation, just because of chance? That's the idea between common cause and special cause variation. So here, maybe if you could show your boss that the process looked like this, you would have a little leeway to say, I don't know what's going to happen next week, but I'm sure working on this process, and these are the things I'm doing. What do you think? Would that cut any soap? Depends on where you work, right? I guess if you work at Procter & Gamble, it might cut soap, right? Never mind. I'm sorry. That's an industry I'm not used to industry jokes in, so. If you were a mine or an automotive company. Here, you might want to predict the future. Let me ask you a question. Let me tell you a little story and ask you a question combined. And you're already getting wary because you know I've been trying to trick you all afternoon. First hour and 10 minutes. You get a letter from a stockbroker. You never heard of this guy. But this guy's got a great recommendation. Tells you in a couple terse paragraphs that they have this great tip that you should buy stock XYZ because it's going to do great things in the near future. What are you going to do? Bet $10, right? No. What are you going to do? Ignore it? Throw it away? Yes. See, I gave you my background. We're pretty stoic. We're also kind of, careful. So I would, statistician would be pretty skeptical of this, so I'd throw it away. But, say just for discussion's sake that you noted that they said stock XYZ is going to go up. And you watch, and over the next 2 weeks, let's say the next month, it goes up by several percent, 5%, 10% of its value. You make a note of it. The next week, next month, you receive another letter. It says, I suggest you sell stock ZZZ, say. Now, you don't own any of stock Z, but if somebody was pointing out to me not long ago, that won't prevent you from selling it. What are you going to do? Well, let's say you're a skeptical type still, and you choose not to sell it. And then next month, you notice that it goes down. Next month, you get another letter giving you some advice, and it's right. The next month, you get another letter, and it's right. The next month, 5th month in a row now, you get another letter, and it's right. What you going to do? Some people are nodding their heads. Their eyes are getting big, and they're getting a little shine to them. We got a good thing here, right? Maybe some of you would invest. Now, being a statistician, I would say, well, what are the odds that they just guessed right 4 times in a row? If they flipped the coin and guessed, sort of 50-50 each time, right? So you'd have 1 chance out of 16 that this guy would have guessed right 4 times in a row. So that's not long enough odds, because I'm skeptical about people like that trying to get my money. So I'm not going to do anything. I've had several people say at this point they'll call their stockbroker and ask him to investigate the stock. Well, so the 5th one's right, and a 6th letter comes, and it's right too, and a 7th letter comes, and it's right too, and now the 8th letter comes to your door, and why do I stop again? Well, now even being a statistician, I say 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2 7 times is 1 over 128. There's less than a 1% chance this guy's just been guessing the whole time. You going to bite? What are you going to do? Now, it's sort of subsided, but it used to be when I told this story, there was a small chorus of, call the SEC. But what are you going to do? Let me tell you something about the process that generated these letters and brought them to your door. On stock XYZ, you were suggested to buy. On stock ZZZ, I think we had a sell. And then on and on. Let's say you had a buy request, a buy request, a sell. Let's say there's a buy, a cell, a cell, and a cell. It doesn't really matter what they are, but now we had 7 letters, and the 8th letter comes to us, and it suggests we buy. And the question is, what do we do at this point? Do we listen to it? And all I want to do is tell you a little bit about the process by which these letters came to your door. See, this young stockbroker was very enterprising. They hated making cold calls. They were supposed to be making cold calls in his office, and he wanted to generate business other ways. So what he did is he bought a mailing list. They're not very expensive, relatively. He bought a mailing list of 10,000 likely investors. And he sent out 10,000 letters, 5,000 of which said, buy. 5,000 of which said, sell. Guess what? He was right half the time. And then the next month he sent out 5,000 letters. 2,500 buy and 2,500 sell. You can see the way this is going. He's not going to pursue these people. All right, so now we got another sell over here. And so now we're down to 1,250 of each. The 4th letter was 625 of each. And the 5th letter, let's say there were 312 that were right and 313 that were wrong. Bad luck. So the next one, there were 156 correct and 156 that were wrong. The next letter had 78 of each, if I've done my division by 2 correctly. And the next letter, he sent out 39 buy letters and 39 sell letters. So if you got a buy letter here at the 8th letter, you're one of 39 lucky potential investors. I use lucky advisedly. How would you have been most lucky if you've been one of these first 5,000 and hadn't been harassed anymore? Do you think maybe it would be useful to know how the data that you look at come to you? That's the point. All right, so anyway, even if a process looks stable with respect to some plotted characteristic, I'd be careful if I didn't know what the process was that generated the data. Okay, any comment, question? Let's move on to one of my very favorites. Histogram below represents the yields of the first 60 batches produced by a new PIDO line. Now, I'll confess to you that these aren't real data, but I will confess to you also that they are generated by a real example at one of the big food companies in Minneapolis, of which there are several. This one recently, well, about a year and a half ago now, has some mascots that changed accents. A little fat guy and a big green guy. Anyway, the little fat guy's involved in the PIDO process. And he now speaks with an English accent, I think. The question here is, what does this histogram tell you about the process from which these data came? Now you'd say, come on, let's have a chorus. Nothing, right? It tells us nothing about the process from which these data came. It tells us something about what happened. It tells us nothing about the process. You wouldn't believe how many people say, oh, it came from a process that's stable and in statistical control. Obviously, if the histogram looks normal, it had to be a stable process. What I respond to that, one-on-one, is not repeatable over electronic media. You can tell what happened over these 60 PIDO yields. People get these ideas very firmly in their mind. I'll give you 2 scenarios, both of which could have created the same histogram. Here's the first one. If you saw this run chart, what might you conclude about this process? Might conclude that it's stable with respect to that characteristic, yield. I would still like to know something about that cause system. Now, people call me well, they call me a consultant because I never answer their questions. I ask them more. They say, well, can you predict what's going to happen with this process? And I'll say, well, I'll help you predict. See, that's an easy way to never be wrong, right? But I don't have the knowledge of their process. I don't know what's been going on during these first 60 PIDO runs. Have they been changing conditions to try to optimize this process? You might think so in the first 60 batches on a new line. Here's another histogram. Another run chart from the same histogram. Honest to goodness, this run chart generates the same histogram as the last one. Now you might say, well, of course. If you have any doubt, what you need to do is, you could physically do this, put together strings and string beads on them, so that, when you stand it up, there's a nice bell-shaped distribution, and then turn it sideways and rearrange the beads however you want, any trend or pattern or any kind of thing you want in these set of strings. And you say, why are you belaboring this? This is obvious. But you know what? We did this in class one time, and there was a really bright young engineer, already pegged to, he's going to have incredible impact on their company. When we showed this to him, he refused to believe it. He said, oh, I know you can play your tricks. You can make that happen, but it doesn't happen. It will never happen in a real situation. You will never have a process where you get a nice bell-shaped histogram that was not a stable process. You will never have that. My only hope for that company is they're wrong about his impact. I guess we got through the logic, but not the emotion. Any comments about this? Here's another one. You better be careful if you're working in this PIDO line. You better not show these data to management, because you know they're going to fit a line and project when you're going to hit 100% yield. And next year's budget will be based on 105% yield. Any comments? All right, the last couple slides I have to show you. Here are data. I should explain what this is. Oh, in yours, never mind. Yours, it doesn't have it. It just has the picture. Here are a bunch of data. I believe this is a very interesting way to look at data. What we did is over 15 time periods, at 15 points in time, took a sample of 4 observations at each point in time, plotted the dots of each of the 4 observations. And then, on the right-hand side here, if you can't see it sideways, let's turn it this way. We constructed a histogram from those 60 observations. Now if I ask you, what does this histogram tell you about the process? You don't have to say nothing. You can say, well, just a minute, let me turn my piece of paper this way. And I'd say, well, it looks like, what would you say? Maybe a stable process? Some people can see a trend in it, an increasing trend, a very slight increasing trend. You probably want to plot averages and stuff if you want to get some sense of that. But basically, you would conclude that this is sort of a stable process, maybe, without any other evidence. Let's look at some summary statistics. X bar for these data. Anybody got them calculated? Bill Schirkenbach, where are you? If he were here, he'd have them done, right? X bar is equal to 10.9. S equals 2.0. Now, if you really want the other ones that people always do, the range equals 9. The median equals 11, and so does the mode. Big deal, right? Let's look at the next slide, because they go together. Here is now, if the data appeared here as below instead of as on the previous page, what impact do you think there'd be on the measures of center and spread? Interesting question. Why would I ask such a silly question? We'll get back to the why in just a minute. Let's answer the what. So let's look at the histogram again and say, what do you think is going to happen to center and spread? Now, I'll tell you what I did here. These are the same data, except for subgroup 6. Subgroup 6 I perturbed by adding 10 units to each one. Let's just look at the plot, look at the histogram, and guess what's going to happen to these measures. What do you suppose X bar is going to be? It was 10.9 before. Is it going to be higher or lower? Not rocket science, right? Higher. By what? A unit, half a unit, 10 units? Well, not 10 units, right? Out of 15 subgroups, I really added 10 to one of them. So it should be like, kind of like 10/15ths, or 2/3 of a unit. The average is actually 11 well, with all the rounding and stuff, it's 11.6. And let's get the median and the mode out of the way. The median now equals 11 still. The mode, look, that switched because I took 2 11s and no 10s, so now the mode is 10. Didn't change very much. Now, what happened to, well, let's dispose of the range too. That's an easy one. The range is, before it was 15 minus 6, right? Now it's 22 minus 6. So it went from 9 to 16. What happened to S? It increased, right? A little? A lot? 5%? 10%? 20%? Stop me when I get there. 30? 40? 50? 60, 70, 80, 90, 100? Standard deviation is 3.2. It was 2.0 before. It's 60% higher. 4 observations out of 60 were perturbed. I would assert influenced by a special cause. And the summary statistic increased by 60%. Whew. Now, you might say, I wasn't using my head because it surprised me when I looked at the number. And if I'd gone through it, which I did, that's what I would have gotten. 60% higher. 4 points out of 60. Anybody in an organization where somebody computes an estimate of variability for an X bar and R chart based on sample standard deviation of all the data? You might not want to do that. What do these things do? What is a standard deviation supposed to measure? Variation. Random fluctuation, right? Random fluctuation in the process? No. Random fluctuation in the population or distribution you just made. So what we're doing here is we're characterizing this distribution with those measures. Now, if you wanted to say something now about the process, do these measures mean anything applied to that process? Nothing is too strong. Well, maybe not. What do they tell you about the process? See, if the process gave us a histogram, you know, I drew a picture of a stable process before, and I made it look like it was normal all the time. Well, it was supposed to look like it was normal all the time. If this process looked like, you know, at every point in time, if it looked like this standard deviation, this mean, this mode, this median, would all apply to that process. You see what I'm saying? It's very unlikely that was the case. It's more likely this process looked like this most of the time, and it looked like this at one point in time. So these summary statistics do not do anything to describe that process. Comment? What does it do to describe the process? So I'm going to ask you to predict what's going to happen over the next 5 time periods. And you'll use that X bar and that S to estimate those? See, I don't buy it. Maybe, if you could tell me that this was really a random event, and periodically you're going to see points up there, I still wouldn't buy it. Because the process was never giving us this. It never gave us that. So it seems to me it doesn't make sense to project into the future something that the process never gave us. Okay. All right. Frequencies? Who knows that? Okay. See, as a statistician, what I would do is I'd ask some questions. First of all, what was going on here at this point in time? Maybe the data were recorded wrong, but maybe they weren't. But in no case would I use these statistics to estimate the future. I would try to understand what was going on here, and if I was going to use anything to predict the future, I would use the data without this as long as I had the understanding of what was going on there, recognizing that if anything special happens, I'm going to be in trouble. All right? If anything special happens, I'm likely to see points that are outside of where I expected to see them. But I would not use data, statistics that summarize this histogram, this distribution that never, ever, ever existed. I wouldn't use them. Not for that. Well, you're talking about several things there. You said if you were doing a design of experiments and wanted to see the effect of a special cause, you would induce that special cause and see what the effect was. And apparently it made an effect here. It just happened. So you would let that monitor the way you projected the system. See, I would say, first of all, there are two things we do. Take action on the points that don't fit. And secondly, beyond that, understand what the underlying system is. And to wrap up, in conclusion, what I would tell you is I believe one of the most fundamental questions you can ask any time studying any process is, is the process which produces the data I'm studying, is it stable? With respect to the characteristic of interest. If the answer to that question is no, I'm usually not this harsh. Maybe it was really late when I typed this. But I said, use of the statistical tool or concept, any statistical tool or concept which ignores time order of data, and the issue of statistical control is at best risky. At worst, it's irresponsible. And that's the thought I'd like to leave you with today. Thank you.